broadly with everyone who wants to watch. So I know there'll be people who will be watching after today. But Charlie, if I could come to you now, and Charlie and Donna are good friends of mine personally, but good friends of the Chicago Scots. They've been really important parts of our Scottish community, Scottish American community, and back in Scotland for many years. I've enjoyed many terrific nights and times with them. So I'm delighted, Charlie, and grateful to you that you introduced us to Giles. And if I could ask you to introduce Giles to us today. Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you, Gus. Good morning. I'm Charlie Sherwood. I'm President Emeritus of Clan Scott Society. I had two four-year terms and been active on the board for years. My pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Giles Ingram. Giles is the Executive Director of the Abbotsford Trust, which manages Abbotsford House, the magnificent home of Sir Walter Scott located in the Scottish borders. That's Abbotsford behind me and as my backdrop. Giles's talk today is titled The World of Sir Walter Scott at Abbotsford. Giles assumed the position of Executive Director in March 2015 and has capably guided the home and museum into being a major destination in the Scottish borders. Giles has a degree in history with honors from Bristol University and has worked in the tourism industry prior to joining Abbotsford, including a 6.5-year stint as the Chief Executive Northumberland Tourism and almost 8 years as the Marketing and Operations Manager of Destination Bristol. Please welcome Giles.
Thank you very much, Charlie. That's very kind of you. And it's wonderful to get to meet you all and have a few words in advance of this. I'm now going to attempt to talk to you whilst I share my screen and bring up some images, which I will, and then I'll use that as a basis of my talk on Walter Scott and his world at Abbotsford. Bear with me whilst I do that. PowerPoint was misbehaving 2 seconds ago, so it wasn't displaying my speaker notes, but I'm sure I'll manage with them on whether they're there or not. So,
Giles, as you do that, if I could encourage everyone to turn your microphones and cameras off throughout Giles's presentation, and at the end of it, we'll ask you to turn them back on again for questions.
Could the host enable my screen sharing? At the moment, it's not enabled.
Oh, gosh. No, that's me. How do I do this? Giles?
Do you have a screen share option that if you click on it, does that come up with anything? Or if you click on my name on the participants, does that give you any options?
Yes, it does. It does. Make co-host. There we go.
Oh, well done. Excellent. I don't normally use Zoom. I'm more of a Teams person, so.
More of a Teams player. Me too. Should be it now, Giles.
Okay. Hopefully you will now have a picture of Abbotsford with Walter Scott in the corner. Excellent. Okay. Well, this time, rather than Charlie in front of Abbotsford, I wanted to give you an image of the great man himself to start us. My heart clings to the place I have created. I will, of course, weave this story through to the creation of Abbotsford by Sir Walter Scott, but as with so much of his life, so many of his stories come back to Abbotsford. This was his love. This was a place that he created out of his imagination and is quite unlike anywhere else. This is a storyteller's house, a palace of the imagination, as he called it. But in order to get us to Abbotsford and the creation of Abbotsford, first of all, you need to come on a journey with me from the young Walter Scott through to the point at which actually he was in the position to be able to afford to begin that creation. So Charlie's very kindly introduced me. I am the chief executive of the Abbotsford Trust. We're an independent charity which was set up, well, next year it'll be 20 years actually since we came into being. And very, very kindly, the family, the descendants of Walter Scott's family who had lived in Abbotsford and cared for Abbotsford for so many generations, passed over Abbotsford and 120 acres of the remnants of Scott's estate into the charity, the Abbotsford Trust, in order to safeguard it for the future, in order to keep Scott's legacy alive. And what a legacy it is. There's another portrait of Walter Scott as a younger man. So often he is portrayed as a slightly older man. One almost forgets the younger Scott. But this is a lovely one because Scott was absolutely an animal lover and was always surrounded by animals of every kind at Abbotsford. Cats, dogs, even a pet pig at one point. But there's a reason that we're still today talking about Walter Scott, because the impact that he had on world culture, particularly within the English-speaking countries of the world, of the early 1800s all the way through until, actually, I think this image on the right there of Liam Neeson was a 1990s Hollywood production of Rob Roy, was probably the last major Hollywood production of one of Scott's works. But he was a literary colossus for getting on for 200 years. And it's difficult for us now, I think, because he has fallen out of popular culture to a fair degree, I think it's fair to say, over the last 20, 30, 40 years. He isn't as well read as he was certainly up until the 1950s or 1960s. It's difficult for us, perhaps now, to imagine what an incredibly successful writer he was. So you look back at the 19th century and you could see well after Scott's death in 1832, in the decades well after Scott's death, Scott was being celebrated and commemorated across the world. I expect most of you will know that image on the right, the Gothic rocket ship, as it's often nicknamed, of the Scott Monument, which sits on Princes Street. In fact, this photograph is taken with the photographer's back to Waverley Railway Station. Waverley Railway Station, named after Scott's first historical novel, Waverley, and the novel which launched him from being a poet into a famous novelist. And the fact that Scotland's railway station was named after him, that people by public subscription paid for this incredible monument to be put up in the centre of Edinburgh, gives you a sense of the nation's love for him. But more than that, the love for Scott, the imagery and the associations that he created of Scotland, the Scottish culture that he helped to spread across the globe and to create so many favourable impressions of Scotland through his writing. Your top left there, of course, is the statue to Walter Scott in New York Central Park. And if you're wondering what the rather strange, bloody image in the bottom left-hand corner is, that's actually a rather unusual production of Lucia de Lammermoor. Scott's novel, which inspired Lucia de Lammermoor, an opera written in Naples and first performed in Naples, I think in the 1870s actually has gone on to today to be the most regularly performed opera in New York Met Opera House. And I believe this might be one of their more unusual modern interpretations of it. So the incredible thing about Walter Scott is that you so often encounter aspects of his legacy, not always visual ones such as statues or monuments, but more often culturally. And he's so commonly part of our culture that you often forget where those traditions originate from. So many popular phrases that originate from his writing. I can remember my father quoting to me regularly as a young lad, warnings of not lying. Oh, what a web we weave when first we practice to deceive. So many phrases that are in common use still today originate in Scott's writing. And again, he pops up in surprising places. The inauguration of the American president, even, Hail to the Chief, which is taken from Lady of the Lake, one of Scott's long narrative historical poems, his second bestseller, and was then set to music later on, and is actually, it's found its way into public life in a way which I think Scott would be entirely surprised to hear. And look at this old rake, Rod Stewart. In many senses, you could almost say a more modern cultural ambassador for Scotland, but here embracing the great Scottish emblem of whiskey, which I know certainly Charlie in our audience has an enormous collection of. And it's difficult to imagine, isn't it, images of Scotland without whiskey, without tartan, without the Highlands, without the islands, without castles. So much of this imagery owes a debt for its popularity through to the traditions which Scott had a hand in popularizing. And I'll come back to the whiskey one a little later. And this image, I think, sums up both so many of those iconic themes of Scotland, which come through so strongly in Scott's writing, and through his writing sparked crazes and societies all over the world, through the English-speaking world certainly, with Scottish societies coming into existence across the British Isles and across the Commonwealth, the Empire, the English-speaking countries, and the USA. And many, many people being drawn to celebrating emblems of Scottish cultural identity, often even if they had no Scottish heritage themselves, certainly within the early 1800s and thereafter, I think probably quite often the case, drawn to these romantic images, again, which Scott had such a hand in popularizing. And those icons of Scottish cultural identity, which love them or hate them, they are still there in the popular imagination in one way or another, whether it's Tartan Week this week, striding down Fifth Avenue, celebrating so many of those so many tartans and the iconic imagery which owes a debt to Walter Scott, perhaps also imbibing a little bit afterwards with a whiskey. But where did those particular icons start to become so entrenched in the popular imagination? The reason I've got these images up at the moment is because they, by and large, lend themselves to a particular occasion, which was back in 1821, 1822. George's friendship with the Prince Regent, later King George IV, was such that through his fame, through his writing, that Scott was, to a very large extent, being treated almost as a cultural ambassador for Scotland. And when George, as George IV, decided that he wanted to, at pretty short notice, it has to be said, with just a few weeks' warning, decided that he wanted to make the first royal visit to Scotland in 2 generations, that he wanted Walter Scott to be the organizer of this once-in-a-lifetime event. And this image of George on the right-hand side wearing his Highland tartan, he was wearing this, he was wearing his kilt, he was wearing this regalia because Walter Scott decided that that would be a good idea, and that that George should wear this as his emblem of his royal visit. Quite a risky manoeuvre, not least because actually some of the portraits of George weren't the most flattering. I think this one is a rather romanticized vision of George. Slim, he was a little slimmer in this than he was in reality. If you've heard the children's nursery rhyme, Georgie Porgy, pudding and pie, kissed the girls and made them cry, some say that came from this visit. So that tradition of politicians kissing babies goes back a very long way. Some of the caricatures of George were a little bit crueler. His kilt was said to be a little bit too short for him, and he did raise a few eyebrows and a few giggles, I think. But there was a serious reason that Scott asked George to wear tartan for this really important royal visit. And that was that actually, since the Jacobite uprisings, really in their grandparents' time, within living memory, tartan had actually been made illegal as a symbol of rebellion. And in the early 1800s, certainly by the 1820s, tartan was deeply out of fashion. It was worn by a regiment, a loyal Hanoverian regiment by tradition. But it had fallen out of popular usage, and it was actually the events, the balls, the public ceremonies, George wearing a kilt and tartan himself, which actually launched tartan back in to popular fashion as a symbol of Scottishness. This image on the left, with a gentleman pulling the honours of Scotland, the crown jewels of Scotland, out of a large casket. This is an illustration of the masterminding of ceremony and tradition and the creation of headlines, which Scott so excelled in. He was a master marketeer. So during George IV's visit, he created a parade, a small parade, exclusive invitees only, into Edinburgh Castle, where they discovered the long-lost crown jewels of Scotland. Discovered, I put in parenthesis, because I think probably in reality Scott had, and a few others, had well known where it was and had masterminded this or stage managed this event to get maximum drama out of it. And then later, when Walter Scott was made Sir Walter Scott and received his baronetcy, it was actually for rediscovering the honours of Scotland. Apparently laid to rest in a dark corner of a cellar in Edinburgh Castle, and record keeping not being all that good, was forgotten about, and did apparently have to be rediscovered to a great extent. But Walter got maximum value out of it. This is a painting that gives you a sense of the scale of that visit by King George. It's a little difficult to make out here, but this is a painting of Edinburgh with Edinburgh Castle in the distance, and you're looking across. You're looking down what would now work its way down to Prince Street, and with only weeks of warning to go, Scott had managed this triumphant arrival of George into the harbour at Leith. King George alighted on August the 15th, which happened to be Walter Scott's birthday, having said, as he greeted Walter Scott on his frigate, "Ah, the man in Scotland I most wish to see." To then march, to be borne through into Edinburgh, to thronged streets with hundreds of thousands of people from all over Scotland standing on the streets, all of whom had been told what to wear and the flags to wave, with leaflets that were distributed throughout Edinburgh, printed at Walter Scott's command, so that everything was stage managed. Whoops, going in the wrong direction. So I'm going to take a step back now. If Walter Scott became effectively Scotland's cultural ambassador and reached such a height of fame, and his legacy has been celebrated for so many generations since, how did this come about? How did one man end up becoming so well known, so successful, and such a lightning rod for a whole nation's sense of cultural identity and belonging and images of it internationally? Well, I'm sure with my audience today, I don't need to talk you too much around this rather ancient map, which I managed to find a copy of somewhere. So we've got the Firth of Forth up in the top. We have Edinburgh sitting there. This map here is to give you a sense of Walter Scott's world as a young boy and as a young man. Walter Scott was an Edinburgh and a Scottish borders boy, and his world and his imagination was sparked by his life in Edinburgh and the Scottish borders and the experiences that he had there. So that's where I would like to start. This is an image not of Walter Scott's first home exactly, but in all likelihood, the neighbourhood, an image of the neighbourhood, much as it may well have looked when Scott was born. He was born into a middle-class family. His father was a lawyer, but he was born into Edinburgh's Old Town. It was before the Georgian New Town was built. It was just the early stirrings of the new town were going up, but actually this was, I think this image obviously would have been taken some years after, once the old town had even fallen into further disrepair. So I don't think it was quite this bad as Scott was a young boy, but it was a crowded medieval city. It wasn't hygienic. It didn't have the sewage systems, the plumbing, the water. that the later new town had, and then after the improvements in the old town that came by the way. So it's perhaps not surprising that Walter himself showed the rest of his life the imprint of such unhygienic conditions, because it was as a young lad that Scott contracted polio, and Scott recovered from polio due to being sent to live with his grandparents in the Scottish borders, but actually was left with a limp for the rest of his life as a result of that polio. This is an image of his grandparents' farm in Sandyknow Farm, which you can just see the farm buildings, today's farm buildings of in the right-hand corner there, which was overlooked by Smailham Tower, one of the ancient fortified towers, which so characterise the nature of this lawless region of the borders. And Walter Scott was sent here for a number of years as a young lad. And I think this painting is a lovely one, which is actually now hangs in Walter Scott's bedroom in Abbotsford. And I think it's a lovely romanticized image of the young Walter kneeling with a dog, listening to the older shepherd, hearing the tales of the Scottish borders and Scotland's past, with Smailham Tower in the background there. Romanticized, yes, but I think it beautifully illustrates what Scott would later describe as being his experience as a young boy in this very formative period of his life, because he was living in a time where the printing press was starting to become more established as a means of people hearing their news, reading stories, keeping up with gossip, keeping informed. It was print was increasingly how people were imbibing their cultural life. But it was all still very recent and cutting edge technology. And the older generation came from a background which went back generation on generation upon generation upon generations of verbal storytelling, of telling tales from person to person down through the ages. And the Scottish borders had an incredibly strong, deeply rooted history, born out probably out of the fact that it was such a lawless region for so many generations. Earlier, I was chatting to a Kerr in our audience, and those family names in the Scottish borders, Scott, Kerr, so many more, Armstrong, there's so many strong names which you will still find prevalent all across the border region, into Northumberland and to Dumfries and Galloway and into Cumbria. Those families were actually, for some generations, probably more important at times than the nation that that person belonged to, whether it was Scotland or England, or perhaps moving between the two if you were living very much on the border. These were the lawless regions, and these were the regions where family meant protection. It was who you went to in order to be safe. This was the Raider period, the Reaver period, and it was a reason that buildings like Smailham Tower are so prevalent across the border region, because people had to live in fortified houses or have a fortified house that you could retreat to when the raiding party came across from England, across the Cheviot Hills, to take your cattle, to take your sheep, and vice versa, it has to be said, equally. Smailham Tower, you can in this picture, you can climb today. It's cared for by Historic Environment Scotland, and if you haven't been, you must do, because it's a very evocative way back into that period, because it sits with the most commanding views. You can walk up to the roof, find the little stone seat that the watchman would have sat in you can imagine in the most horrific weather, and you can actually see as far as the coast in the east, and almost as far as, well, you can see as far as the Pentland Hills and as far as the watchtowers would have been to communicate through to Edinburgh when you needed to call for help. And this was the world that the young Walter Scott grew up in. And he always said that this was what fired his imagination, hearing those tales in the hearth, in the kitchen, passed down through that older generation. And the stories that he was being told weren't without visible remnants. So whether that was ancient fortified hilltops, whether it was the ruins of abbeys of old, this is Melrose Abbey in the top left-hand corner, and the Scottish borders is littered with the ruins of great abbeys, or whether it's not just as the fortified houses, but the castles and the keeps which litter the countryside. And in Scots Day, the more modern ones, which are becoming a little more decorous. The Kerrs, of course, having become the Roxburghs, and the Dukes of Roxburgh, and had in the 1770s, I think it was, put up Flores Castle, which was a lot more comfortable than ones like the bottom one in the bottom left. But in the fields or the grazing lands of the Scottish borders as well, people were unearthing Roman ruins and Roman remnants and statues as well. So Walter was growing up in an area that was full of history, full of visible history to illustrate the tales that he was being told for the past. Scott recovered. Life had to take a more serious tone. He had to turn. He had to knuckle down, go to school back in Edinburgh. And he studied law to follow in his father's footsteps. This is an image of the new Georgian house, which his family moved to out of the old town a little later, when Scott was a youth. And Scott did well in his studies. I don't think he ever claimed to have set the world alight as the most academic and successful of all scholarly lawyers. But he was competent. He became writer to the Signet, which is the professional body for solicitors. And he became a member of the Faculty of Advocate. And as an advocate, the lawyerly profession centered on the courts. So he was established. He was establishing himself as a young professional. And he chose to make his way in life as an advocate. And as an advocate, you would be self-employed, and it would be your responsibility to find your clients and to build up your client list. So it rarely happened that a steady income dropped into your lap. It was tough going. During this period, Scott would have experienced the salons of Edinburgh. This was the Enlightenment period that Scott was growing up into. This period of ideas, of the rational against the mystical past, was what Scott imbibed all around him. And this gives you a lovely, again, somewhat poetical illustration of an Edinburgh salon. And this is an illustration of the only time that it's known that Scott and Robert Burns met. Scott, as a young lad, precociously spoke to Robert Burns very briefly at an evening when they were both present, and this painting brings that to life. So the young Walter Scott was establishing himself as a professional advocate, and had ambitions to establish himself as a family man as well. So during this period, we would have been talking about 1800, 1801, 1802. Walter Scott was trying to find his professional feet. During this period of time, he was friendly with the Wordsworths, and was a regular visitor to Cumbria, to the Lake District. And it was actually whilst visiting William Wordsworth, the famous poet, and his wife Dorothy, in the Lake District, that he was introduced to a young French lady, Charlotte, and this is a portrait of Charlotte. Remember, of course, this is during the period of the Napoleonic Wars, and Charlotte had no family in this country. She had come to Britain during the incredible unrest in the period of the French Revolution, and then leading into the Napoleonic Wars. But Scott was introduced to her when he was with the Wordsworth. And to this day, if you're ever in the Lake District, you must find your way to a small stream which exists on maps and is signposted as the popping stone, a particular point on the stone, the popping stone, because that is where Walter Scott popped the question, where he proposed marriage to Charlotte. So that's one of those expressions that's found its way through into modern usage, isn't it? To pop the question, now known as the popping stone, because Walter was the first. Walter was fortunate in that he managed to establish a regular source of income in this period as well, in becoming Sheriff of Selkirkshire, which meant that he presided as the Sheriff of the Court of the town of Selkirk in the Scottish borders, not far from Smailham, where his grandparents' farm was. And this gave him a base in the borders. He also ended up becoming clerk to the Court of Session in Edinburgh. So Scott found himself practicing law in the Scottish borders and in Edinburgh. His first property he bought was in Edinburgh, and this is South Castle Street, and this is where Scott lived from 1801 to 1826. He was living life between Edinburgh and the Scottish borders. Scottish borders was really where he wanted to buy a second property as well. This is an image of Melrose Abbey in the period, and as you can see, if you look at it, it's quite overgrown. Walter Scott was increasingly active as an antiquarian. This was a period of time where Scotland's ancient buildings were really not as valued as they later became through the antiquarian movement, which Scott was a foremost proponent of. Walter Scott was traveling widely with friends across the Scottish borders in this period, visiting ruins of abbeys, of castles, of keeps, of historic buildings, which he was advocating to be protected and to be preserved for the future. Dare they be lost forever? And during this period as well, he was traveling and speaking to local people and collecting and writing down those tales of the border period, of the border lands, of the border warfare periods, and a lot of folklore and ancient beliefs. And it was those beliefs which found their way into the first publication of Scott's, the Borders Minstrel. Sorry, I've lost my position on the slide. Apologies. the Borders collections of folklores and tales, which Walter Scott published, was his first formal publication, and it was modestly successful. It didn't set the world on fire, but it did actually give him the background in tales and folklore and chivalrous stories of the Borders, which went on to inspire this manuscript in this image. This is an image of the Lay of the Last Minstrel, and this is actually the very beginning of Walter Scott's original compositions. So up until now, he had been translating. He actually translated German poetry, and he'd been collecting and retelling tales from the past. But the first time he laid pen to paper was on this page here, to create his own first original composition, and that became the long narrative historical poem, The Lay of the Last Minstrel. And this tale was absolutely rooted in everything which Scott had been soaking up through his travels for so many years through the border regions. It tells a tale. It's told through the mouth of a minstrel being a wandering storyteller. They're died out pretty much by this time, but had been a feature of the Scottish border region for generations. These have been the people who would go. They would earn a living by going from town to town, village to village, being paid to retell tales of the past. And they'd done that through long rhyming tales. And Scott had recreated that with his own original composition, The Lay of the Last Minstrel. And it's this rollicking tale which is of families, border families, skirmishing at war with each other, but it also weaves in the folklore that he'd been picking up. It has a malevolent magical goblin called Gilpin Horner, who changes shape and takes over, or changes shape and becomes a young boy and an assistant to a knight, takes on his form and actually creates mayhem in this story, which actually leads to two knights fighting a duel in order to settle the dispute between the two families. And it starts off with a wonderful scene of a knight being sent by his I suppose a princess to gallop across at nighttime through the Ettrick and the Yarrow valleys, through the tumbling waters of the fast-flowing streams, to Melrose Abbey, to go to a tomb of Michael Scott, Wizard of the North, because he was buried with a magical spell book within his hand, and by gathering that spell book, they would have incredible powers. So he was writing something which was quite unlike anything that had ever been written before. And when it was printed and unleashed on an unsuspecting public, it took off by word of mouth and was immediately incredibly successful. And Scott found himself, actually, in between it being sent to the printers and actually being published, Walter Scott had gone off on a tour of Scotland's lighthouses. So he had absolutely no idea how it was going to be received until he came back to discover that actually it had been a roaring success. And this was the poetry which established his fame. Some of you might recognize these words. I'm sure you will do. They found their way into popular imagination. Breathes there the man with soul so dead, who never to himself hath said, "This is my own, my native land," whose heart hath ne'er within him burned, as home his footsteps he hath turned, from wandering on a foreign strand. If such there breathe, go, mark him well, for him no minstrel raptures swell. High those titles, proud his name, boundless his wealth as wish can claim. Despite those titles, power and pelf, the wretch centred all in self, living shall forfeit fair renown, and doubly dying shall go down to the vile dust from whence he sprung, unwept, unhonoured, and unsung. Scott went on to publish 3 more particularly well selling poems. Lady of the Lake was particularly successful. And I'm going to go back. I'm getting ahead of myself. This is what happens when you lose the presenter view in PowerPoint. So I can't see which slide's coming up next. So apologies. He was associated. He was associated as the author of these poems because gentlemen wrote poetry. But about the period that he bought the land, which then became Abbotsford, and I should have explained actually that this is actually an image of Abbotsford with the Eildon Hills in the background, nestled just out of view actually in the trees at the bottom of this valley, overlooking the River Tweed, which Scott so loved. But this next image gives you more of a sense of what it was like when Walter Scott discovered this. Walter, by virtue of becoming Sheriff of Selkirkshire, which was a job for life, and paid a reasonable income, around about £80,000 a year in today's money, so about $100,000 a year. Plus he was clerk to the Court of Session. And now he was earning money from his publishing. And he was earning probably in the region of about $70,000 in his first year off his publishing alone. So rather than renting houses as he had been in the Scottish borders with his family, he took the step of buying his first property. And he bought Cartley Hole Farm. And this is an image of it around about 1812. And as it says here on the slide, with a porch added by Scott, the porch, I think, illustrates that Scott had pretensions to grandeur which well outstripped the farmhouse that he had bought. And I always think that over the next few years, his wife, Charlotte, and family must have, a young family, 4 young children, were incredibly patient with Scott as he added on to this house and remodeled it, added on wings, demolished parts of it, and ended up recreating something which had no link really back to the original farmhouse at all. And what an expensive endeavour it was. An expensive endeavour, but one which Scott embarked on in full confidence that the next publication that he would write would be successful. This image here is a collection of the Waverley novels. And so far in my story, Scott has only written poetry. He hasn't written any of the historical literature which went on to become even more, make him even more successful and famous. Waverley being the first of those. Walter Scott would later in life say that the reason that he decided to switch from poetry to writing a novel, which was not considered to be a gentleman's endeavour, was because by that time Byron had appeared on the scene. And Scott went from being the foremost poet in the country to being eclipsed by Byron. And Scott would say that he could never match Byron, and therefore he was actually far better to actually switch to another form of writing entirely. And he would tell the tale of going back into his attic in Abbotsford and opening an old chest and discovering a manuscript which he had set aside some years before, unfinished, of what he then took down and dusted off and became his first historical novel, Waverley. But unlike this image you see on the left, where it says by Sir Walter Scott, because gentlemen weren't seen to publish novels, he published it anonymously. He also did so very financially astutely, or so it seemed for a number of years. So the business of publishing meant that generally 3 enterprises made money when a novel was written and published, if it was successful, and most weren't. The author would take a percentage of the earnings. The publisher would take a percentage, selling it into bookshops and to traders, and the printer would take a percentage for printing it. And Scott went into business very early on in his writing career with friends of his in Kelso, the Ballantines, James and John Ballantine. John being the publisher, John being the printer, and James ultimately going on to being a publisher, representing Scott's work from time to time. And publishing being a rather precarious industry, Ballantines issued quite a bit of debt from year to year to keep itself going, which Scott, in the first instance, bought and became a shareholder in the publisher. And as time went by, he ultimately ended up becoming the sole owner of Ballantines, something that he always kept very quiet and hush-hush. And also ultimately the sole owner of the publishing business. So Scott was earning ultimately in a number of years as he established his writing career, at every point in the publishing journey. I wish I could say that Scott was always incredibly financially astute, but that wasn't always the case, because he did actually, in his early times with Ballantines, insist that a number of other authors' works were published, which didn't go on to be very good sellers, and sat in the storeroom unsold for many, many years and became a source of financial distress. But Scott always was nothing if not self-confident, and had the most enormous belief in his own ability to write his way through to the next bestseller and to earn. And it was through that he had the confidence to be adding to his landholding as Abbotsford and to be creating the house that we now know and associate as being such of Scott's his built legacy. In this image, let me just describe what I'm looking at. So you have the walled garden with a flag tower showing prominently there with the saltire. The building to the left of the turrets was the house that Walter Scott built and finished, but hiding just to the left, slightly obscured by bushes and trees, as a wing which was added on by Scott's granddaughter, Charlotte. Charlotte and James Hope Scott, as the family had then become. And you can see in the style of it, it's really quite eclectic. He was a magpie, drawing on every aspect of history, not necessarily always Scottish as well. I think from the walled gardens, where you can see the round turrets, it almost looks quite medieval French. A style which came to be known as Scots baronial and became hugely fashionable, and therefore reproduced all over Scotland and as far afield as Australia, Canada, and doubtless in parts of the United States. In large part carried by Walter Scott's fame, because Abbotsford became very, very quickly one of the most famous houses in the Western world. Queen Victoria, I'm jumping ahead chronologically after Scott's death, always said that Walter Scott's novels were her favourite, and visited Abbotsford, and then went on to buy what then became the land of where she established Balmoral, which she instructed to be designed, inspired by Walter Scott's Abbotsford and Scott's baronial style. So you can see he had quite an influence within architecture as well. Step inside the building, and his antiquarian interests become immediately apparent. The panelling in this is his entrance hall, and it looks so much older than it actually was. So the fireplace there was actually a copy of the Abbot's seat in Melrose Abbey, just a few miles downstream along the Tweed. But the wood panelling was from Dunfermline Abbey, and it was salvaged. It was going to be thrown out, and Scott, through his antiquarian connections, was able to source that. As proved over so many years, he was able to source so much of the collection, this astonishing collection which he amassed. which you see very well represented on the walls in his entrance hall. Scott was what would he was very much an early practitioner of what would today probably be called living history, because he very much felt that actually having a tangible connection with the past through an object was a way for him to access stories of the past. And so many of the stories that found their way into Scott's writing, you will find a connection through to something on his walls or within his collection at his house, or indeed, of course, within his incredible library. And it was really quite eclectic. Within this entrance hall, you'll see everything from, incredible amount of Marshall collection, but also you will find things from across the world as it was being discovered. So you'll see South Sea Island clubs propped up against the doorway to his study on the right-hand side there. But you will find things from the Napoleonic era that he was living through. So behind the camera, there would be breastplates found from the Battle of Waterloo, to which Scott was a very early visitor after the battle. And within this image, facing across the entrance hall, suits of armor, the one on the right being a German jousting suit of armor, perhaps an inspiration for Ivanhoe. The one on the left being a medieval English suit of armor. But you have to remember that Scott was a storyteller, and not everything is as it might seem. And Abbotsford is never as it might seem. It is a storyteller's house, first and foremost. And that suit of armor, I think, is a good illustration of how I always imagine when I'm showing anyone around Abbotsford, how Scott might have been acting as a host, telling a story, telling a tale around everything that he had collected here. And the tale which Scott used to tell of that suit of armor was, because it was unusually tall, people will be much shorter in the medieval period and the early Tudor periods. The tale which Scott would tell was that it was actually worn on the Battle of Bosworth Field in the War of the Roses by Sir John Cheney, an English knight who was known to be the tallest knight on the battlefield. The only problem being is that we know that actually that suit of armor was probably made about 60 or so years after the Battle of Bosworth Field. But Walter Scott never let a good story get in the way of reality. This is walking on through into Scott's study at Abbotsford, and you can just see up in the top there that it's two-storied. So there was a balconied level with a spiral staircase in the corner, which went up a tower to his dressing room adjacent to his bedroom upstairs. And this is the chair and the table at which he sat to write so many of his works, his historical novels, and also many of his bestsellers in later life, in which he was very much trading on his established fame as Scotland's de facto cultural ambassador. And I think this is also a period in which, in later life, it's appropriate to explain that Scott's story of rise to great success was not one which stayed with him throughout his entire life. The financial arrangements he had, which worked so well for him, being invested in publishers, actually ended up being his Achilles heel. There was a recession in the years following the Napoleonic Wars. And this was in the days before limited liability in companies, where if a company went bankrupt, that debt was held by the owners of that company personally. And in that economic recession, companies which Scott had significant interest in, and indeed his publishers, went bankrupt. And Scott became liable for personal debt to what would now be some probably £12 million in today's money. Now, that tragedy happened only 6 months after he also lost his wife Charlotte to a young death as well. This was a terrible year for Scott. And his reputation as being a man of an honor was to a huge extent established in that year by how he dealt with it. He never walked away from that debt. He swore that his right hand would pay it off. And pretty much that's what he achieved. His creditors recognized that actually if Scott was to sell off every asset that he owned, his house in Edinburgh, his collection, his library, Abbotsford itself, and the land that Scott had amassed around Abbotsford, some 1,200 acres of land by this period. If Scott had sold it all off, he would still not have cleared all of his debt. He'd probably still be in debt to the tune of 4 or 5 million pounds. But such was Scott's fame that anything he wrote was a bestseller by this period, even if it wasn't always of the best quality. And I'm never going to be someone to claim that everything Scott wrote was absolutely brilliant. He was a prodigious writer, and it sold. So therefore, he was commercially well worth keeping writing. So his creditors put Abbotsford into trust so that Scott could effectively remain living in Abbotsford as if it remained his family home, so that he could continue writing, because Scott and his collection in Abbotsford was his muse. And from that point on, Scott continued to write and wrote furiously to pay off that debt. But he worked so hard that ultimately his health deteriorated as a result of the hours that he was putting into it, and led to first of a series of small strokes. And I will come on to that in a couple of slides' time. Before I do that, though, let me just quickly whistle you through a couple of other rooms at Abbotsford. His magnificent library, of course, some 9,000 books in Scott's study and library. And this is one of very, very few writers' libraries which are intact. Scott could walk into this tomorrow and go to the shelf that he had left the book at, and that book would be there. It's been catalogued since Scott's day through to this, and has been incredibly cared for, and contains the most incredible collection, many unique, not only from Scott's period, but going back into medieval publishing periods as well, earliest days of the printing press, and manuscripts before that. That silver urn was a gift from Byron. You step then through into what was very much the ladies' room, the Chinese drawing room, as it became called by virtue of its Chinese wallpaper. And this incredible chandelier illustrates the fact that actually Abbotsford was the first gaslit house in Scotland. So Scott was a man fascinated by modern technologies as well as the past. Step through the drawing room and you're into this armory, incredible eclectic collection of everything from muskets, pistols, executioners' swords, daggers, South Sea Island clubs. Why the fascination with martial collecting, martial history? Scott would often say that if it wasn't for his polio, which had driven him into the law and into writing by virtue of his infirmity, he would actually rather have chosen to go into the military and be a soldier, but he was never able to do that. And you can see where that fascination with military symbolism and the past took him. And step through into Scott's dining room, the family dining room, which adjoins the self-catering wing, which was the later addition by Charlotte and James Hope Scott. A lot lighter by virtue of a later member of the family in the 1920s, 1930s. Major General Maxwell Scott married an American lady who found the darker paint tones in the rest of the house a little gloomy. She had it lightened up. But this room has many tales to tell. This is the original dining table surrounded by family portraits with the bay window overlooking the Tweed. And this painting here gives a little bit of a sense of that same dining room in Scott's last days. I mentioned that Scott worked himself really effectively into an early grave. He had a series of small strokes and was becoming increasingly unfirm in the early 1830s. And he was advised by his doctor to go to the Mediterranean for his health, and he'd never been to Italy, always wanted to go to Italy. So he went to Italy in 1832, but not long after he was there, his faculties declined markedly, and one would assume that he had had another small stroke. His writing was becoming very unclear and unlucid. His speech was he was finding talking difficult. So he and his family and the people around him felt that his days were drawing to a close, and Scott wanted to spend his last days at his beloved Abbotsford. King George IV sent a Royal Navy ship to bring him back to the British Isles, and from there he found his way back to Abbotsford. But he was too ill and infirm to make his way up to his bedroom, so a daybed was made for him in the dining room, and this is an illustration of what that may have looked like. And Scott spent his last, I think it was probably about 10 days or so, in a daybed overlooking the River Tweed, and this is where he passed his final days. The end of an incredible man with a legacy which went on, as we all know, to live so far beyond his own years. I think by postscript, it's worth adding that by this time, Scott had very nearly cleared all of his debt, and but not quite. So his family sold off his last remaining copyright that he owned of some of his works. He had sold off a lot of it already, or had never owned some of it. But in doing so, they managed to clear his debt and were able to hold on to Abbotsford and secure Walter Scott's collection, his house, and his estate for future generations. Quite an accomplishment, quite a journey, quite a life story. This is Walter Scott's Abbotsford from the Portcullis Gate entrance on the right-hand side, and shows more clearly the later editions put up by Charlotte and James Hope Scott. Also on the left-hand side, the Catholic chapel on the left there was put up by them as well. This was put up in the 1850s. And the family continued to care for Abbotsford. They didn't always live at Abbotsford. There was a period in the late 1800s when they were living in London. They were renting out Abbotsford, and the early 20th century. But they came back to make it their main family home in the 1920s, 1930s, when these two ladies' father, Major General Maxwell Scott, came to live at Abbotsford and make it their home. And Jean and Patricia, I think in a photograph here, probably from the mid-1980s in the walled garden, inherited Abbotsford. They never went on to have children. And caring for Abbotsford was their life's work. And they kept Abbotsford open to the public as it had been since 1833. The public rooms in Abbotsford are so well preserved, and they are so close to as Scott would have known, simply because the family had taken in paying visitors to those public rooms from about 6 months of Scott's death onwards, a tradition which the family continued for nearly 200 years. But the family didn't always have the money it had had in Charlotte Hope Scott's time when they were able to afford to extend Abbotsford. The family actually, certainly in the 20th century, was struggling to care for Abbotsford financially. And by 2004, when Jean passed away, Abbotsford was actually the only source of revenue for Abbotsford was paying visitors, but paying visitor numbers had declined over the years. And over the generations, the family had, including by their father, had been selling off plots of land and houses on the estate for years and years and years beforehand in order to make ends meet. But with the passing away of Jean and Patricia, it was the family felt that nobody could afford to take on Abbotsford. It needed too much money spent on it. But rather than sell it into private hands and it would become closed to the public and the collection would be broken up and no longer housed at Abbotsford and sold off, much of it privately, they wanted it to be passed to a charity to care for. At that time, the National Trust for Scotland felt that they couldn't take it on. They had too many financial challenges of their own at the time. Scottish government felt that it wasn't right for them to take it on. A study was done which said that some £15 million needed to be spent on it, probably in today's money, getting on for about £18 million. Abbotsford came very, very close to being sold. But the family's executor to the will brought the family together and proposed that they might consider passing the house and the estate and the collection into the ownership of a new independent charity, and he would put together some trustees and they would attempt to take care of Abbotsford and invest in it and to run it as a heritage charity to keep Walter Scott's legacy and the family's legacy alive for the future. And to their credit, the family took that risk and they did that. And the Abbotsford Trust, I'm here 19 years later, came into being, immediately went fundraising, just 3 trustees to begin with, who'd never done anything like this before. But this is what they went off to do. And they raised and invested within, from 2007, when the trust was established, through to 2013, had raised and invested somewhere in the region of £11 million. And what an enormous amount of work needed to be done. I know that some of you will have seen Abbotsford during this period and will have seen the before and the after, but seeing the scaffolding in this image gives you a sense of how much work needed to be done just on the stonework. But the whole visitor experience had to be improved as well if Abbotsford was going to work for the future. The first thing you would have seen on arriving in a small car park, crossing a busy road and then walking down to Abbotsford in the past would have been this garden shed, which is the tea shop. And then you would have entered Abbotsford through the cellars. But the vision of the trust at that time was to actually create the kind of visitor experience that they felt was needed and is needed in order to attract today's visitors. This is a photograph of the visitor centre, a very brave modern building put up on the outskirts of the historic land, and a cafe upstairs, but downstairs an exhibition. So for the first time, we had space to be able to tell the story of Scott, his journey through life and his impact on the world about us before setting foot into Abbotsford itself. The Hope Scott wing was converted in that period into the most wonderful traditional Scottish but luxurious self-catering accommodation. And there are some images here of that wing. And I know that speaking to some of you before I started this talk, some of you have stayed there. So you take the whole wing yourself, six bedrooms. And you'll rent it for 3-4 nights up to a week or longer. And you are effectively staying in a museum because it is furnished with a lot of original furniture, paintings, books, memorabilia. It is like stepping back into the past. It is exquisite, but with all mod cons. And that period culminated with a grand reopening by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. In 2013. And I will conclude by just illustrating the work of the charity as it continues today. this looks a little bit science fiction-y, doesn't it? But actually, every January and February, when the house is closed to the public, it's open every other month of the year for visits. That's when our conservation cleaning takes place. And this is an illustration of there's a cycle of taking books off the shelves in the library where dust is kicked up, or where there may have been a history, perhaps a leaking gutter down the outside of that wall, in order to check for spores or mold growth. And the entire collection is checked over an incredibly busy 2-month period. People will often ask me, what are you doing in January and February when the house is closed? You must be having a nice relaxing time. Far from it. It's one of our busiest periods. This just illustrates the importance of conservation as well. This is in a glass-topped table in the library, and a good example of light damage. So last year, thanks to very generous donations, we were able to put up some lines to reduce natural daylight and UV coming through the windows of the library. This is the Napoleon's blotter taken from his baggage train at the Battle of Waterloo and collected by Scott on his visit to the battlefield. And on the one side, the velvet is incredibly faded. In fact, the velvet has almost entirely disappeared. On the other side, it's almost as good as new. And it's the faded side, which actually sits in shade in that table, but is on the side which is exposed to light. And that's pure light damage. The Trust goes on to keep Walter Scott's legacy alive in many other ways. The Duke of Buccleuch, to whom Walter Scott looked in his own lifetime as a chieftain of the clan, is the patron of the Abbotsford Trust and established a number of years ago the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, and also a Young Walter Scott Prize to encourage school children to come to discover Scott's legacy and to write original historical fiction themselves. This is a photograph taken from the prize giving ceremony last year. The Duke on the left-hand side there, just to the right of the gentleman with the lanyard and the beard, is our trustee Matthew Maxwell Scott. We always have a family member on the board of trustees. Maxwell Scott is a family name through the female line now. And the Abbotsford Trust runs the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction, continuing to benefit from the support of the Duke of Buccleuch, but also other funders as well, including a New York-based Hawthornden Foundation, to whom we're very grateful for their support for the next couple of years. I think that rather quickly brings you up to today. I tend to finish with encouragements of support for the Abbotsford Trust to help us in keeping Scott's legacy alive. And you can do that in any number of ways, by visiting, by spreading the word. Come and stay in Abbotsford itself, of course. Do donate. The charity needs to raise somewhere in the region of £350,000 to £400,000 a year in order to cover its operating costs. So you're getting on to nearly $500,000 a year. And do keep reading Scott. Keep his literary legacy alive. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Giles. That was terrific. Really, really enjoyed the trip, and I'm quite homesick now, being from just a few miles away. I will encourage all our attendees and guests today to now turn back on your cameras and microphones. And Giles, I think we have probably a few moments if you have time for some questions and comments and reflections. If anybody would like to share, the floor is open.
I have a question, Giles. This is Charlie Sherwood. You said the operating costs are, you need to raise about £350,000 a year. Are there aspirational goals for the trust now? I know you've put in some attractions. Are there aspirational goals to do more at Abbotsford?
Thank you, Charlie. Yes, absolutely. So the Abbotsford Trust, at its heart, is about two things. It's about caring for the material historical legacy that we have responsibility for, but it's also about that cultural legacy. And we are so keen to bring more and more people to discover Walter Scott, his writings, his legacy, and to discover the world of Sir Walter Scott, aptly for the title of this talk today, the world that Scott strode into through his own writing and through his own imagination. And we want to bring that to people from all walks of life and all ages. So we've got to focus, and have done for the last 3 years and going forward, to broaden the appeal of Abbotsford and the ways in which we tell those stories at Abbotsford, but also beyond Abbotsford as well, so that more people from a wider range of ages and backgrounds can discover these incredible stories, and to be able to reflect on Scott's greatest legacy, I think, is about actually causing you to think about where we come from individually, collectively, culturally, as nations, as groups within nations, and causing us to think about that, but also to come increasingly, I think, to discover great writing and great stories. So in the last few years, we put up a folklore woodland sculpture trail called Witch Corner. So we chose 7 of the folklore tales that Scott really loved, and tell that in a way which has been designed for young children and families. And the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction we took responsibility for coming up to 3 years ago now. And we've started to partner with the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. So we're doing outreach talks and training courses in literary history. So reaching people in new and diverse ways from all walks of life is what we're really keen to do more of.
Questions for Giles or comments?
Yes. Yeah. Hello, Giles. My name's Catherine Scott. That's really my name. And I live in Orlando, Florida. And I am getting ready to join other members of the Clan Scott Society for a visit to Scotland in June. And we will be visiting Abbotsford, which I'm very looking forward to. And as part of my preparation for this tour, I was reading the description of where we're going, and I decided to read The Heart of Midlothian. I have never read Sir Walter Scott before, so this is a first. And all I have read so far is the introduction and the opening story. And I want to be the advertisement here to tell you this is fascinating. This is 1820. I now know, with help from Google, why the locals go to downtown Edinburgh and spit on the heart of Midlothian. I know why. I know who Helen Walker is, and I know where her gravestone is and who inscribed it. And I'm also absolutely stunned to read, this is called A Moral Dilemma. This novel, Heart of Midlothian, is described as a moral dilemma. And it is, I've read enough about the story to be absolutely shocked. I didn't know they talked about things like this in those days. So I just want to throw that out there and say, if you're looking for a good read, I do read it more slowly than I might read ordinary books. I do like to take time and look up words. He is a man of absolutely brilliant vocabulary and expressing things. And of course, one of the first things they have is a conversation in a pub. And so in my visit, I'm looking forward to grabbing some of my travel colleagues and going into pubs and having conversations, because that looks like an amazing place to connect and meet up. But I did want to encourage people. This book is an undiscovered treasure for me, and I'm finding his writing very, very interesting.
That's lovely to hear that, Catherine. I think Heart of Midlothian's one of my favourites as well. And I won't say too much about it in case I spoil the plot line for you as you're about to read it. But you'll have doubtless, as you say, you've read the early part of it, rooted in Scott's knowledge as an advocate and in the legal history of Scotland. In fact, it actually starts off, doesn't it, as young Scots travelling across to Dumfries, I think it is, and they get into trouble on the journey and hear the tale, which becomes the Heart of Midlothian tale. But yes, Scott was, in some sense, educating people about their own past in so much of what he wrote, because he would be drawing in the case of the Heart of Midlothian, on actually a really tragic period of Scotland's legal history, which I don't know. How much will I ruin for you, Catherine, if I just briefly say what that legal history was rather than the story itself?
I know about the old toll booth prison and why people spit on that heart-shaped tile in downtown Edinburgh. I'll say that.
Okay. I might leave you to most of you to imagine maybe the rest of the tale, but yes, it is.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. It's all right.
So yes, it was a period when a law was passed that was designed to encourage what was perceived as a practice of people who had children, who had babies, but they couldn't afford to care for them. So they would effectively, they would kill their children or have them killed. And it was designed to outlaw that. But actually the tale of the Heart of Midlothian is really based around actually the unforeseen consequences of that tale on an innocent person. And the Heart of Midlothian itself was the nickname of the jail which stood in the centre of Edinburgh by St Giles Cathedral, which is where the novel takes its title.
Well,
but it's a good one.
I am aware of the story, but you clarified something for me. I was aware that that there is somebody who's charged with murder of a child, but I assumed differently. I assumed it was the murder of an unborn child. Thank you for clarifying.
Don, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out another aspect of Sir Walter Scott's legacy in this country, which was the famed abolitionist Frederick Douglass took his last name from a Sir Walter Scott novel. He had escaped slavery in Maryland and ultimately ended up in the Boston area, where the family that hosted him had been reading one of I believe it was Waverley. I don't recall exactly, but one of the Scott novels, and Frederick at that point was looking for a new name, not his slave master's name, and his host suggested Douglas, and so that Frederick added the little S to it, so it was not the traditional spelling, and that became his surname. Frederick Douglass also was a great lover of Scotland and went back in the 1840s. And kind of ironically for Illinoisans, Stephen Douglas, the Democratic senator and slave owner, birth name was originally spelled with two S's as well. And because of Frederick Douglass's fame as an anti-slavery advocate, Stephen Douglas changed his name and removed the final S. And so there's quite a legacy here in Chicago of Sir Walter Scott.
That's fantastic. That's really interesting to hear. Thank you, John.
Any other questions or comments before we conclude today? Hearing none, I just want to, on behalf of everybody who's been on the call today and everybody who will watch in the times ahead, to thank you very much, Giles, for a terrific presentation. I encourage everybody, as Giles extended an invitation to us to visit Abbotsford, and if you do go to that visitor centre, the cafe and restaurant, I've never had a bad meal there yet. I think it's terrific. So you're to be commended for many things at Abbotsford, and we look forward to seeing you in the borders.
You're all very kind. Thank you very much. And if anybody would like to get in touch with me, please do pass on my direct contact details. And I think maybe that's Jack or whoever's got them. By all means, please circulate them around.
We'll add them to the video when this gets published, so those people who are watching in the times ahead can also have your contact details.
That'd be lovely.
Giles, thank you very much. I promise I'll come and see you next time I'm in Scotland. I'm bringing my two sons over in July, so we'll come and see you then. Take care.
We'll see you in June, Giles.
See you then, Charlie and Donna. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.